writing on foreign policy, which is what this book is about, was a real departure for me. And what I want to talk about this afternoon was how I wove together the ideas for this book, how different sets of ideas came into my head, and they became the basis for the take here in this book on the United States in the Middle East. So if we go back about 6 years, the book began to take shape in my head in 2008, early 2009. This was the time when there was a war between Israel and Hamas, and if that sounds familiar, it's for good reason. And a couple of things were happening back then. First of all, I was teaching a course, something like this. It's a big course, 300 people, and it's about the making of the U.S. As a worldwide player in international affairs. And I began to think, I had taught this course numerous times, but each time I teach it, I begin to puzzle over some of the things that I had said many times before. And one of the things I start with in that class is, I have to figure out how to move the,
sorry,
that's okay. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, first, one of the things I talk about early on is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and you see him there. I'm going to talk about that picture in a few minutes. And I began to ruminate on this question of the U.S. for the first time during World War II, beginning to think about playing an ongoing role everywhere. Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, you name it. World War II transformed the United States into a world power, and within a very short time after the war, it had a substantial presence on every continent in the world. It began to expand that presence in many ways. It built over 700 military bases abroad, most of which are still in existence. And the question came up, how was the U.S. going to play this role? What kind of problems was it going to face? What did it want to achieve? What was going to be its way of operating? And what was kind of amazing to me and really struck awe in me was that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as he was the commander-in-chief in prosecuting World War II, began to think about these post-war questions in a very sophisticated and deep way, bringing advisors in to ask, how should the world look in the post-war period, once the war is over? And I should say right off that what was foremost in the minds of Roosevelt and his lieutenants was really two things. First, the Great Depression. How are they going to prevent the kind of economic nosedive that had occurred starting in 1929 and all through the 1930s that had really brought international trade to a screeching halt? And second thing that was really on their minds, of course, was how did international security break down to the extent that you had this horrible war? And so he thought about this post-war world then, not surprisingly, in terms of two broad categories, security and economics. On security, he wrote an article in a magazine, a very popular magazine at the time, Look magazine. Anybody ever hear of Look magazine? It was really big. It was for the American public, in which he developed the idea of what he called the four policemen. And his idea was that if you have the major powers of the world working as a team to maintain international security, then you are going to achieve two very important goals. First of all, you will have the big boys with all their muscle working in concert to prevent any aggression in any part of the world. This wasn't an idea that had any regional basis to it. He saw the world as the playfield here, and the four major countries, which were the United States, in his mind, the United States, Britain, Soviet Union, and China. These four countries would be the gatekeepers. They would make sure that no aggression was going to go on, and therefore keep world peace. But it would have the second utility of somehow dealing with the tension that was bound to arise among these four powers. That is, they would be sitting in the same room, they would have this institution, whatever it would be called. Later, actually, the Security Council of the United Nations came out of this concept. They had the fifth power, which was France. And they would be containing their own hostility towards each other by working together to maintain world peace. So that was his first idea, right? We're going to have security. Now, this was really a radical idea in many, many different ways. But for one, the United States was coming out of this war as the unsurpassed single global power that so dwarfed the strength of China and the Soviet Union and Britain. The idea that the United States would share in the governance of security with these other countries was quite radical. The second sphere, as I mentioned, was economics. And he was worried, FDR that is, was worried about a couple of things. One I already mentioned was the breakdown of the global trading and financial system in the 1930s. He was also worried because the United States had been so successful economically during the war. By the end of the war, the United States had most of the world's gold in Fort Knox. It had most of the world's manufacturing capacity, more than half the world's manufacturing capacity. It was the overwhelming economic power. And there was a great worry that with all this tremendous productive capacity that the United States had, that it wasn't going to have sufficient markets domestically for all that it could produce. And it wasn't going to have sufficient places to invest all that gold from Fort Knox. And so he was looking for an international system that would allow the United States to sell goods abroad and to invest U.S. capital in enterprises abroad. And so he was trying to figure out how to do this and how to reduce what he felt was the inefficiency of the world market, the kind of serendipity of the way things worked, the risk, the high risk, this kind of chaotic world of international trade and international finance. How do you make it less chaotic? And his answer was that you build international institutions, and these international institutions would govern the world economy. And he saw a few institutions, some of which we still have: the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is called the World Bank, something that he called the International Trade Organization, which actually never got off the ground, but became first something called the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and more recently, in the 1990s, I think it was, became the World Trade Organization, which is a very powerful organization today. So underlying FDR's conceptions, both in the security realm and in the economic realm, was the idea of shared governance. The four policemen, these international institutions. And it wasn't that he was going to give up U.S. power. He had a kind of conception of the like the world as a corporation, and the United States would be like the 51% shareholder, which meant that 49% other countries, other powers would share with the United States. And when you're a 51% shareholder, you have to actually be quite attentive to the other shareholders as well. Now, there was a lot of backlash against this. We're giving up sovereignty. These are things that we should be doing as the world power. How can we give this over to some international organization, an international bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. But they went ahead and they did it. And one of the key elements underlying FDR's thinking, and this was all this was going through my head as I was trying to figure out this book, was the notion that if the United States was going to play a world role in every nook and cranny of the world, everywhere, this could bankrupt the United States. No matter how powerful and wealthy the United States was, if it was going to play a force everywhere, it was going to bankrupt itself. And therefore, it needed a way to somehow diminish the expenses, the resources spent. And the way to do this was through shared governance. Get others to shoulder some of the burden with you. And therefore, you won't have to be doing everything, militarily, economically, and so on. This conception, I'm going to come back to it again and again, this conception that the United States could go bankrupt was on the mind of every single president in the 20th century who followed FDR. It was even in the mind of 21st century presidents, which means George W. Bush and Obama, but as you'll see, George W. Bush had a very different conception from many of the others. So FDR wanted to signal to the world that the United States was not going to just withdraw as it had back in the 1920s and become kind of inward-looking, that it was going to continue to play this role, and so he decided to go to the Middle East during the war and make a statement by saying, we're going to be here, and we're going to be everywhere. And this is a picture from that. So what did he do? Many of you have heard of the famous conference at Yalta. Yalta's a kind of in the news these days in Ukraine and Russia. But he went to, there was this conference in Yalta, and Yalta is generally considered the conference where the Allies decided how the world would look after World War II. We're not going to go into that now, but from Yalta, he took a sea voyage from Yalta through the Mediterranean to the Suez Canal, and on a ship met the king of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz, there. And this was an amazing thing. First of all, to take this very perilous journey when the war was still going on, this sea voyage. Second of all, if anybody has ever seen a picture, I didn't bring it with me, but a picture of FDR at Yalta, he looks half dead at Yalta. He really looks half dead. And he had prosecuted this war, and actually he would die within about 6 weeks of Yalta. So he was extremely sick, and he went nevertheless to make this statement. Actually, in this picture, he looks, can't see it too well here, but he looks a lot better than he looked at Yalta. Maybe the Middle East sun revived him. I don't know. And so he was saying, he was making a statement not only about the Middle East, here's a map of the Middle East, not only about the Middle East, but about the world, that the United States was going to be a player, an everyday player in the Middle East and elsewhere. And the Middle East was picked because of its importance, geopolitical location, right at the kind of crossroads of Africa and Europe and Asia. Obviously, its oil was on people's minds. Palestine was becoming a very big issue before the war, and was going to clearly be an issue after the war. And so everything about the Middle East sort of spoke to his making a statement about the U.S. role in the world. Now, what happened was, he died, as I said, and he was succeeded by Harry Truman, who became the next president, and things changed extremely rapidly, extremely rapidly. The Cold War began, the face-off between the Soviet Union and the United States. The idea of big powers cooperating and becoming four policemen and sharing power became institutionalized in the Security Council, but it became a bit of a joke because they couldn't do it. There was no containing the hostility between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so everything after the beginning of the Cold War, and we usually date that 46, 47, somewhere in there, 1947, almost everything becomes seen through, in American terms, through the lens of the Cold War. What happens in the Middle East is not so Middle Eastern as it is kind of what's going to happen to the Soviet Union here, how are we going to react, are they going to win, are we going to win, all those kinds of things. And still, actually, let me see. I'll wait for the next slide for a minute. Still, Truman had many of the same concerns that Roosevelt had, and that is the bankrupt issue. How is the United States going to contain costs, especially as it has this worldwide competition with the Soviet Union? And what's more is, he and almost every president thereafter had this contradictory impulse. One was they worried about this bankruptcy issue. The one who actually articulated it the best was Eisenhower, who succeeded Truman, who said, right out, we're going to bankrupt ourselves if we don't do something about this. Right? If we don't find a way to contain our role worldwide, we're going to bankrupt ourselves. But Truman was concerned with it too, like others. And Truman began to see the world in a very different way from Roosevelt in order to contain these costs. Instead of seeing the world as one big playfield where powers would engage each other, Roosevelt began to see the world as a series of regions. Europe is a region, Africa is a region, the Middle East is a region, and so on and so forth. And this was an important change. And the way Truman saw of containing the costs first developed in Europe, and that was, we will find in each region, and in Europe it was Britain, a strategic partner. And this partner won't be a world power. It'll just be a regional power. But in the region, it will bear some of the costs, take some of the lead, take the burden off our shoulders. If we can have a partner like that, first it was Britain in Europe, and then they later added Germany to that, these two powers were going to sort of take the burden off the United States. And in security terms, the United States would build a military alliance, it was NATO in Europe, and this military alliance, similarly, every country would contribute troops and money and all those sorts of things, and this would lessen the burden on the United States. And in the European region, this worked pretty well. And what Truman tried to do, and almost every president thereafter tried to do through the 20th century, was to replicate the success of that European model in other parts of the world. Let's find a strategic partner in the Middle East. Let's find a strategic partner in East Asia. Let's find a strategic partner in Latin America who will bear some of the costs. And in each of these regions, let's build a military alliance, just like NATO. And in the Middle East, they built, I don't know, at some point I counted them, how many actual military alliances the United States built. I think it was 5. They all had different acronyms, except the one which was the one that we remember, which is called the Baghdad Pact. And all of them failed. They all failed. And the United States was constantly scampering, looking for a strategic partner, and you couldn't find your little Britain in the Middle East or in other parts of the world. So the Middle East became very critical for Truman in 1947. He issued the first doctrine. I think every president since then has had a foreign policy doctrine. Right? Even Obama, they talk about the Obama doctrine, the Bush doctrine, the Clinton doctrine, and so on and so forth. This was the Truman doctrine, and you can see the date up there, and I'll give you a second to read that. If you can you see it from the back, or do you want me to read it to you? Can you see that? Is it okay from the back? And the idea here was very simple. Greece and Turkey were both experiencing communist insurgencies, and the United States interpreted these insurgencies as aggression by the Soviet Union, and it put in some money and other things to prevent these communist insurgencies from succeeding. So this was really the beginning of the United States' deep involvement in the Middle East. And so this was the first set of these 4 ideas I'm going to talk about today, was this how the United States was beginning to, how United States presidents were beginning to conceive of the issue at hand. I started to say something before and I didn't actually finish my thought, which was each of these presidents was very concerned on the one hand with the cost. As I said, they were worried about bankruptcy. But on the other hand, they were setting in motion processes that they had really very little control over, which was creating what we now call the national security state. The growth of the CIA, the growth of the NSA. And if we, in the last year, for those of you who have been reading the newspaper, last year or two, have seen how the NSA, in a sense, became a kind of independent power with a tremendous budget. And it wasn't at all clear that President Obama knew what the NSA was doing or had control over what the NSA was doing. So you had more and more expenses growing, built into the growth of this national security state. At the very same time, these presidents saying, oh my God, this is going to bankrupt us, right? And they had real things to worry about. So this was the first thing that I thought about as I taught this class, was how the United States developed its kind of game plan that it was going to use around the world. The second thing was I was interested in how this game plan actually worked within a place like the Middle East, which had its own set of dynamics. The United States and even the Soviet Union may have thought of the Middle East as just a place where the two of them are at loggerheads and one is gaining and the other is losing, but people in the Middle East didn't think that way. They had things going on, right, in the Middle East. And I was giving, because of this Gaza war that was going on that time, I was giving a series of talks. And in these series of talks, I was trying to think through this, what happened to the Middle East? What kinds of changes were occurring there? And to what extent did the United States' model of building a military alliance and finding a strategic partner actually work with that? And what I found, I sort of found it late in the game of writing this book, is that the Middle East has a kind of major upheaval where all the dynamics of the region, I can define dynamics for you later, but you get the general idea, all the dynamics of the region change massively. And this happens about every 30 years. From 1918 on, the slide that kind of shows these, I call them sea changes in this slide, like that. So here you see them. The first is 1918. The Ottoman Empire comes to an end. That's huge. The imperialists come in, the British and the French. They divide up the region. There are new national states in some places. Everything changes. 30 years later, 1948 to this 1952 period, you have another major upheaval, the creation of the State of Israel, the first Arab-Israeli War, which goes on from late 1947 until 1949, and the Free Officers' Revolution in Egypt, which was probably the most major of all those changes then, in which a new nationalist regime is coming forward to argue that the imperialists from the first period had artificially carved up the Arab peoples, and that really there should be a unified Arab state under Egyptian leadership. And the key personage here was the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Then 30 years later, more or less, you have, within 4 days of each other, I think, the Iranian Revolution. The Shah flees. The Ayatollah Khomeini returns to the country. They create a new Islamic Republic. And Egypt and Israel quite amazingly sign a peace treaty which changes the entire Middle East. And then finally, more or less 30 years later, the Arab Spring, which you're all familiar with. Okay, so this really struck me that every 30 years this happens, and it's kind of a pattern. What's going on here? And of course, in this last Arab Spring, we're still in the midst of it. We'll come to that at the end. Let's see. Here's the key that I became interested in. I'll just talk about for a moment is the 1979 one. So the U.S. enters the Middle East in the late 1940s, and I have to say that the 50s and 60s for the Middle East, for the United States, were a period of nothing but heartburn and disappointment. The major countries of the region, the powers of the region, were 3 Arab countries: Iraq, Egypt, and Syria. Each of them signed friendship treaties with the Soviet Union. So the United States was on the wrong side of these major powers. Almost everything you can think of that could go wrong went wrong for the United States and the Middle East in the 50s and 60s. And then things begin to improve for the United States. Things begin to change. In that period, that 1948-52 period, in 1967, there was a major war, which we're still facing the fallout from almost, 60 years later? Are we 60 years later, something like that? No. Yeah, almost 60. Yeah, it's getting on. And that's the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the war that the Israelis like to call the Six-Day War, in which the Israelis were victorious, took over the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, they took over the West Bank from Jordan, they took over the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This was the beginning of what now we talk of as the occupation that has gone on and on and on, and been a very, very destructive force. But one of the elements that came out of that 1967 war is that the Soviet Union was weakened badly. It supported the wrong force, and it was seen by key figures in the region, particularly by the Egyptians, who had a friendship treaty with them, as not able to deliver the goods. That is, the Soviet Union really couldn't get the Egyptians what they wanted. And there was more and more thought by the Egyptians that they're going to have to sign on with the United States if they're going to get what they want in the Middle East, which they eventually did. And so all of a sudden, the United States finds itself with two big powers, Israel, which has just won this war, and Egypt, both agreeing to side with the United States. And the United States sort of is, it has a very strong relationship with Iran as well, and Turkey, which is in NATO. So the United States is riding high in the 1970s. And along comes the 1979 Iranian Revolution and begins to add a new dynamic for which the United States was really not well prepared. And what happened in this period, this post-1979 period? The first thing is, a little hard to see on this map, but there was a resurgence of Shiites in Islam. So just a word of background here. Islam basically has two central sects. The Sunnis, most of you know this already, the Sunnis will make up maybe 85 or 90% of the Muslims worldwide, and the Shiites will make up 10, 15% of the Shiites worldwide. It's often hard to count because there are various sects, and whether you count them or don't count them is a big question. But what was true historically, and we can make a broad generalization, is that wherever Sunnis and Shiites lived together, Sunnis lorded it over Shiites. Meaning they tended to dominate economically, politically, socially, almost every way that you can think. Sunnis tended to be higher on the social scale than the Shiites. And what you had in the Iranian Revolution was a Shiite, largely Shiite country, Iran, now leading, spearheading a kind of reaction by the Shiites, not only in Iran, but in Lebanon, and in Bahrain, and in Yemen, and in Saudi Arabia, and in Morocco, and elsewhere, where they're saying to the Shiites, come on, we shouldn't be under the thumb of the Sunnis. A kind of Shiite resurgence. And this Shiite resurgence, the United States government, I have to say, was oblivious to this element of it pretty much. It certainly didn't become a central part of their policy. And this split has only become exacerbated in the 21st century. And much of what's happening in the Middle East today has that fault line as part of the equation. Another thing that happened after 1979, we go back to this map, and I lost my little